Hi guys, this is the Chiasma speaking, and I would like to welcome you all to our channel Chiasma. So today we are going to talk about a very important topic in respiratory system, the oxygen dissociation curve. So how does this curve shift to the right and how does it shift to the left? We'll start from the very basics and let's talk about our blood. Our blood has RBCs and it also has plasma. Talking about oxygen, 97% of oxygen is transported via RBCs and the rest of 3% is dissolved and transported in plasma. So we know in RBC there is a red colored pigment which is called as hemoglobin. You can think of hemoglobin like a truck which loads its material of oxygen at the level of lungs and it delivers at the level of tissues, which it unloads the oxygen. So this hemoglobin has 4 chains, alpha 2 and beta 2, which means there are 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. So that's how we write it, alpha 2 and beta 2. In these chains, in one chain we have one heme compound. So actually the oxygen binds to this heme compound and there are 4 heme compounds in one molecule of hemoglobin. So one hemoglobin will deliver how many molecules of oxygen? It can carry a maximum of 4 molecules of oxygen. And this binding which happens with oxygen plus hemoglobin leads to formation of oxyhemoglobin. So this reaction is actually reversible. That is why when we need to dissociate the oxygen from the hemoglobin, it can happen, and when we want the oxygen to bind to hemoglobin, it can also bind. So that is why it is a reversible reaction. Alright, so this one molecule of hemoglobin is carrying 4 molecules of oxygen, and finally it delivers at the level of tissues. Okay, next we are going to talk about very important concept of positive cooperativity. You can think of hemoglobin just like an e-rickshaw. It is very difficult for the first person to sit in an empty e-rickshaw. But as soon as you see that one person is sitting there, another person comes, and then another, then another. Similarly, for our hemoglobin bro, the first oxygen is very difficult to bind because of the structure of hemoglobin. The first oxygen finds it very difficult to sit. But as soon as first oxygen binds, another oxygen comes. And then another comes. And for the fourth and the final and the last seat, the fourth oxygen finds it very easy to sit there. So this is the concept of positive cooperativity. It is easier and easier for more oxygen to bind on the hemoglobin. Okay, so now we are smart kids. We know about the positive cooperativity. Okay, next we come to the main villain, oxygen dissociation curve. Okay, let's not get panicked after seeing it. It's quite easy. We will understand it step by step. So what do you think is the shape of this curve? It is not like a rising curve. It is not like a declining curve. So this shape, this particular shape, which is the S shape, is called the sigmoid shape. This is the thing that we need to remember, that this is a sigmoid shaped curve. But why is the shape like a S? Okay, that's where the concept of e-rickshaw kicks in. This is explained by positive cooperativity. Okay, it is difficult for the first oxygen to bind, and then subsequently it is easier for the next oxygen to bind. Okay, I will explain this in a minute. First we will see the graph. On the x-axis we can see there is the partial pressure of oxygen, which is actually the most important factor which determines the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. Obviously when hemoglobin has to bind oxygen, so oxygen plays the main role, right? Like its pressure determines how easily oxygen is going to bind hemoglobin. Okay, so on y-axis we have the percentage saturation of hemoglobin. That means how much percent of hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. Alright, so we know in graph, in the initial part, like here, on increasing just a little bit amount of oxygen, we are increasing just a little bit amount of oxygen, there is massive increase in saturation of hemoglobin. Why? Because as soon as one oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it is very easy for the second and third oxygen to bind. Okay, so that's why the curve takes a steep rise here, and initially it's a little bit slow because it takes a little bit time for the first oxygen to bind, then it takes a rising curve and then it plateaus out. But why does it plateaus out? Obviously because an e-rickshaw cannot carry more than its capacity, right? It's very illegal, but some e-rickshaw people do it anyways. So the maximum capacity of hemoglobin is to bind with 4 oxygen. So that's why it plateaus out or saturates. Okay, so now we know why the shape of the normal oxygen dissociation curve is sigmoid. Okay, now we have another thing written here, P50 and 50%. So what is this P50 thingy? So this P50 thing, P is the partial pressure of what? We are talking about oxygen, right? So partial pressure of oxygen. So it is the partial pressure of oxygen at which 50% of the hemoglobin molecules are saturated. What am I saying? It is the partial pressure of oxygen at which hemoglobin is 50% saturated. Alright, that means again go back to the e-rickshaw. That e-rickshaw thing, okay, please mind my drawing. That e-rickshaw thing, when 2 people sits there easily, comfortably, it is said to be 50% saturated. So it applies again to hemoglobin. So this is the P50 values. In the subsequent slides, we are going to discuss how this P50 value is going to shift to the right or to the left, whether it's going to increase or decrease. Okay, so now we will talk about a little tricky part, the shifting of the curves, when it shifts to the right and when it shifts to the left. Okay, but nothing is tricky for us. Now we are going to talk about when this oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve shifts to the right. We just need to remember that this happens at the level of tissues. Alright? At the level of tissues, oxygen is delivered. Okay, it no longer wants to bind to hemoglobin. It says good, bye bye hemoglobin. You can go away to the lungs and take more oxygen. So at the level of tissues, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is decreased. Hemoglobin no longer wants to bind to the oxygen because oxygen wants to go to the tissues, into the cell, and then further it will be used for glycolysis and cellular metabolism. Okay, so the delivery of oxygen is increased because oxygen is no longer bound to hemoglobin. Okay, so what will happen to the P50 value? We know that P50 value was what? P50 value was how much pressure of oxygen is required for the hemoglobin to be 50% saturated. Here, saturating hemoglobin is very difficult at the level of tissues, like on the right shift. We are talking about right shift here at the level of tissues because oxygen is dissociating from hemoglobin. The P50 value will increase. It is the pressure of oxygen. So more pressure of oxygen will be required at the level of tissues to saturate 50% of hemoglobin because hemoglobin does not want to bind oxygen. That is why P50 value on shift to the right increases. Affinity of hemoglobin decreases and delivery of oxygen increases. Okay. Now there are some conditions which cause the shift to the right. We just need to remember, when does we want more oxygen to be delivered to tissues? When? Think of yourself when you do an exercise. Okay, you want more tissues to have oxygen, right? You want to deliver as fast and as efficiently as possible to the tissues so the skeletal muscle can function. So the shift to the right is the thing which happens when we do exercise. Okay, so when we do exercise, what happens? You get warm, right? So the temperature increases during exercise, and during exercise what happens to the acid level in body? More lactic acid is produced, so H plus increases. And now there's one thing which is called 2,3-DPG. We will understand this by a sweaty, stinky fellow which just sits in the e-rickshaw. Inside the e-rickshaw, again mind my drawing please, when this stinky, sweaty person just sits there, no more passenger wants to sit in that e-rickshaw. Everybody's like, we are going to get off. So you will think that this 2,3-DPG actually does not allow oxygen to bind it. So the oxygen which was sitting here is thrown outside, doesn't want to sit with this stinky guy. Okay, so what actually happens is this 2,3-DPG stabilize the hemoglobin. The hemoglobin no longer wants to bind to oxygen to be stabilized. The 2,3-DPG takes care of that. So that is the actual physiology. Okay, so the 2,3-DPG increases in the shift to the right. And now there are some conditions like anemia, hyperthyroidism, high altitude. Okay, in hyperthyroidism, temperature increases in the body because the basal metabolism increases. So increased temperature again explains this thing. During high altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen is low. Okay, so the low partial pressure of oxygen which occurs at the level of tissues, that is where oxygen dissociates from hemoglobin. We know that at the level of lungs, partial pressure of oxygen is high, high PaO₂. So oxygen binds to hemoglobin, but at the level of tissues, PaO₂ is low. So at high altitude also PaO₂ is low, so the oxygen dissociates. And in anemia, since we have less hemoglobin, we have less blood, so the body needs to deliver more and more oxygen to the tissues. We have less trucks, right? Trucks or the e-rickshaws are less. So whatever e-rickshaws we have, we need to deliver as much as oxygen to the tissues, so to prevent the hypoxia. Hypoxia means decreased oxygen delivery to the tissues. So less and less oxygen is getting delivered in anemia. So we need to increase it. That is why the graph will shift to the right in case of anemia. Alright, and we should also remember that it is the decreased PaO₂ and increased H plus and increased temperature. These three things cause the graph to shift to the right. Alright, next we are going to talk about the shift to the left. The shift to the right was at the level of tissues, so this is at the level of lungs. So what happens at the level of lungs? We have lots and lots of oxygen, and there is increased affinity of oxygen to bind with hemoglobin because it has to be delivered to the tissues, right? So it binds easily with hemoglobin. So affinity is increased, and there is no such delivery in the lungs, right? It happens at the level of tissues. Now what will happen to the P50 value? Think about it. P50 represents what? It represents how much pressure of oxygen is required to saturate 50% of the hemoglobin. So at the level of lungs, shift to the left, we want the association to happen. We want the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin to happen. So the P50 value is decreased. With just a little bit of partial pressure of oxygen, the 50% of hemoglobin is saturated. So that's why we say when shift to the left occurs, there is decrease in P50 value. Now, similarly for the right, we have the causes of shift to the left. 2,3-DPG. So this stinky, sweaty person is no longer there in the e-rickshaw. You can easily come and sit there comfortably. Alright? So we now know this. And there is decrease in H plus and also decrease in temperature. Just opposite of what happened then the shift to the right. Okay, just the opposite of what happened when it was dissociating. Now we need to associate, we need to bind, so just the opposite. In right there was increase in temperature and increase in H plus, and on the left there is decrease in H plus and decrease in temperature. Now the fourth person is carbon monoxide. So it has 200 or 300 times more affinity to bind to the hemoglobin compared to oxygen. So this is the thing which like hugs and completely like hugs it around the hemoglobin. It does not let it go. So this is something like a very creep fellow who does not want to leave hemoglobin. And the final and very interesting one is the fetal hemoglobin. This is the fetal hemoglobin. So the fetus inside the mother lying in the womb, how will that fellow take oxygen from mother? It needs to have greater affinity for oxygen to take the oxygen from the mother. If it has less affinity, then how will it take oxygen from the mother? Because the baby is surrounded by the amniotic fluid. It does not have air around it. It has to take oxygen from the maternal vessels. And how will it take it? When it has more affinity than the mother adult hemoglobin. Mother's hemoglobin has less affinity, or you can say the fetal hemoglobin has more affinity. Okay, so the fetal hemoglobin extracts oxygen from the maternal adult hemoglobin. Okay, just a quick recall. When does the shift to left happen? The shift to the left happen when we do exercise. And when we do exercise, how will we remember then the shift to the right occurs? Because during exercise we have lactic acid formation, our temperature increases and our oxygen pressure is decreased because we want the oxygen to be delivered. And how will we remember the left one? Just remember one thing, you remember the right and the left one is exactly the opposite. Okay, left one is exactly the opposite of the right one. Okay, so finally, just a question for you guys. How much of the oxygen is delivered by 100 ml of blood to the tissues? You can write your answers in the comment. Okay, so if this helped you visualize the concept, give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos. Drop in the comments if you want me to explain another topic. Bye bye.